Hello and good day. Today we will continue the discussion in nature and effect of obligations. This is actually part 3 of the nature and effect of obligations. So without further ado, let's start. Today, I'm going to discuss the remedies of the creditor. There are some cases na kung saan hindi na-perform ng debtor ang kanyang obligation, or there are some cases na kung saan na-perform niya pero meron siyang na-violate dun sa terms and conditions. Meron siyang na-violate dun sa agreement nila ni creditor. In case na mangyari yon, merong remedies ang creditor. At yan yung pag-uusapan natin for today. What are the remedies of the creditor if the debtor fails to perform his obligation to deliver a determinate thing? What are the remedies of the creditor if the debtor fails to perform his obligation to deliver a generic thing? What are the remedies of the creditor if the debtor fails to perform his obligation in obligations to do? And what are the remedies of the creditor if the debtor does what has been forbidden him? Let's start with number 1. If the debtor fails to perform his obligation to deliver a determinate thing, the remedies of the creditor are to compel the debtor to make the delivery and to demand damages from the debtor. These are Article 1165 and Article 1170 respectively. Take note that the thing here is determinate thing or a specific thing. In case hindi na-perform ni debtor ang kanyang obligation na i-deliver yung determinate thing or specific thing kay creditor, ang gagawin ni creditor ay i-compel niya or i-force niya si debtor na i-deliver na niya yung specific thing or determinate thing. Aside from that, magdedemand din si creditor ng damages kay debtor. When we say damages, these refer to the harm done and the sum of money that may be recovered in reparation for the harm done. Meaning to say, kapag sinabing damages, ito yung kabayaran dun sa harm na naidulot ni debtor kay creditor. Let's have an example. D is obliged to give C a specific car. On due date, C demands delivery but D does not deliver. Ang obligation ni D ay to deliver a specific car to C. Yun nga lang, nung nag-demand ng si C, hindi dineliver ni D yung specific car. In this example, it is clear that the debtor fails to perform his obligation to deliver a determinate thing or a specific thing. In this case, C can compel D to deliver the car. And aside from that, C can also demand payment of damages from the debtor or from D. Next, if the debtor fails to perform his obligation to deliver a generic thing, the remedies of the creditor are to ask that the obligation be complied with at the expense of the debtor and to demand damages from the debtor. These are Articles 1165 and 1170 respectively. Take note that the thing here is generic thing. Kanina, determinate thing, ngayon naman generic thing. In case na hindi na-perform ni debtor ang kanyang obligation na i-deliver ang generic thing, ang gagawin ni creditor ay to ask that the obligation be complied with at the expense of the debtor. Meaning to say, gastos ni debtor. Aside from that, to demand damages from the debtor. Magdedemand din ng damages si creditor kay debtor. Let's have an example. D is obliged to deliver 5 sacks of rice to C. D does not perform his obligation on due date upon C's demand. Yung 5 sacks of rice, yan ay generic thing. Ang obligation ni D dito ay i-deliver yung 5 sacks of rice. Yun nga lang, nung nag-demand si C na i-deliver na ni debtor yung 5 sacks of rice, Hindi dineliver ni D kay C yung 5 sacks of rice. So it is clear that the debtor fails to perform his obligation to deliver a generic thing. In this case, C can obtain 5 sacks of rice from other sources at the expense of D. Pwedeng gawin yan ni creditor kasi nga yung generic thing pwede yang i-replace. Pwedeng bumili ng 5 sacks of rice from other sources si creditor or si C, pero gastos ni D. Aside from that, C can also ask for damages from D. Next, if the debtor fails to perform his obligation in obligations to do. Under this, we have to. If the debtor fails to perform the obligation or performs it but contravenes the tenor thereof, and if the debtor performs the obligation but does it poorly. Unahin natin yung A. If the debtor fails to perform the obligation or performs it but contravenes the tenor thereof, the creditor may have the obligation executed at the expense of the debtor, and he may also demand damages from the debtor. These are Article 1167 and Article 1170 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines. Meron tayong tinatawag dito na contravention of the tenor of the obligation. Kapag sinabing contravention of the tenor of the obligation, ito yung violation of the terms and conditions of the obligation. Kapag hindi pinerform ni debtor ang kanyang obligation to do, or kung pinerform niya, pero yun nga lang merong contravention of the tenor of the obligation, the creditor may have the obligation executed at the expense of the debtor, meaning to say gastos na naman ni debtor, and aside from that, he may also demand damages from the debtor. Let's have an example. D is obliged to construct a hollow block fence for C. By agreement, the fence will be 2 meters high and 10 meters long, fine finished, and painted. D does not perform his obligation upon C's demand. In this example, the obligation is obligation to do. Kasi ang obligation ni D is to construct a hollow block fence for C. Ang kanilang pinag-usapan, yung taas ng fence o bakod ay 2 meters at ang haba ay 10 meters. Fine finish daw yung bakod and at the same time painted. Pero yun nga lang, nung nag-demand na si C, hindi pinerform ni D ang kanyang obligation na mag-construct ng hollow block fence. It is clear that the debtor fails to perform the obligation to do. In this case, C can ask another person to, or he himself may construct the fence at the expense of D. So, ang gagawin ni C, pwedeng siya ang mag-construct ng fence or mag-hire siya ng ibang tao para mag-construct ng fence. Pero yung gastos ay shouldered ni debtor or D. Aside from that, C can also ask for damages from D. Take note, C cannot compel D to perform the obligation. Hindi niya pwedeng pwersahin si D na mag-construct ng fence. Why? Because meron tayong mabaviolate na right. Or merong mabaviolate si C na right ni D. And that right is right against involuntary servitude. If D constructs the fence but did not follow the measurements agreed upon, C will have the same rights. Dito, pinerform ni debtor ang kanyang obligation na mag-construct ng hollow block fence. Yun nga lang, hindi niya sinunod yung measurements, gaya ng 2 meters high at 10 meters long. So it is clear na mayroong contravention of the tenor of the obligation. Kapag mayroong contravention of the tenor of the obligation, si C, meron siyang same rights. Next, B, if the debtor performs the obligation but does it poorly, the creditor may have the same be undone at debtor's expense, and the creditor may also demand damages from the debtor. These are Article 1167 and Article 1170 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines. Kapag pinerform ni debtor ang kanyang obligation to do, pero yun nga lang hindi maganda ang kanyang pagkakagawa, the creditor may have the same be undone at debtor's expense, gastos ni debtor. And aside from that, the creditor may also demand damages from the debtor. Let's have an example. D is obliged to construct a hollow block fence for C. By agreement, the fence will be 2 meters high and 10 meters long, fine finished, and painted. D constructs the fence following the measurements, but it was not properly aligned, the finishing was rough, and materials used were substandard. As you can see, sinunod naman ni D ang measurements. Yun nga lang, yung bakod na kanyang ginawa ay hindi properly aligned. It was not fine finished, and at the same time, yung ginamit na materials ay substandard. It is clear that the debtor performs the obligation but does it poorly. So ano ang gagawin ni C? C can have the fence be demolished by another person or even by himself at this expense. So pwedeng i-demolish ni creditor or C yung fence na ginawa ni D. Or pwedeng mag-hire siya ng ibang tao na magde-demolish nung fence. Pero ang gastos, shouldered ni D. Aside from that, C can also demand damages from D. Next, if the debtor does what has been forbidden him, the creditor may demand that what has been done be undone, and he may also demand damages from the debtor. This is Article 1168 of the New Civil Code of the Philippines. Dito, ginawa ni debtor yung hindi niya dapat gawin. In this case, the creditor may demand that what has been done be undone, and he may also demand damages from the debtor. Let's have an example. B bought a farm lot from S. However, the only access from the road to B's lot is the lot of D. So B entered into a contract with D for a right-of-way over a period of 10 years and paid a sum therefore. It was agreed that for the duration of the contract, D would not construct any fence between B's lot and his. Sometime thereafter, however, D constructed a fence in violation of the agreement. As you can see, in this example, ginawa ni debtor yung hindi niya dapat gawin. Based on their agreement, D would not construct any fence between B's lot and his lot for the duration of the contract. But D does what has been forbidden him. Nag-construct pa rin siya ng fence in violation of their agreement. So, anong gagawin ni B? B may demand that D remove the fence at B's expense. So, tatanggalin yung bakod na ginawa ni D because that is a violation of the agreement between B and D. Of course, gastos na naman ni D yung pag-remove ng bakod. Aside from that, B can also demand for damages from D.